Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Tom and the organisers of the Multi-Species Justice Symposium for giving me the opportunity to present this morning. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we stand on, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emergent, alongside their kin, plant, animal, vegetal and elemental. The talk I'm giving today is dedicated to Perpetua, a Marin woman from Merauke, West Papua, who became a close friend of mine during my fieldwork in West Papua over the course of the last 7 years. Perpetua was one among many people who taught me how to walk the forest, how to listen to the forest, and it's in her memory that I'll be speaking today, and I hope that I will do her justice. In May 2016, Mina, a 3-year-old Indigenous Marin girl from West Papua, died of dysentery after drinking water contaminated with pesticides from a nearby oil palm plantation. Mina's grieving parents, Marina and Bernardus, carried their child to the oil palm company headquarters some 20 kilometers away by foot. They asked that the infant be buried in their clan's ancestral graveyard, which was located within the newly established oil palm concession. The company refused. The land was now their property. Burying the child within the plantation would attract insects, fungi, and other pests that would harm the oil palm trees. Bernardus and Marina then pleaded for Mina to be buried in the concession's conservation zone, a 10 by 20 meter patch of sago palm grove amidst a sea of monocrop oil palm, so that their child could rest with her plant and animal kin. This request too was denied. In the interests of protecting local flora and fauna, access to the conservation zone was prohibited to non-company personnel. Finally, Bernardus and Marina buried Mina a few miles outside their village by the side of the Trans-Irian Highway. Since then, the couple told me, their nights have been haunted by nightmares of Mina's frail body being trampled by trucks overloaded with oil palm fruit and by bulldozers clearing the forest to make way for monocrops. The parents wept as they described how isolated and frightened Mina appeared in their dreams, alone by the dusty highway, severed from her plant and animal kin, never able to find rest. Since oil palm arrived, Marina explained, Marin people, we have been robbed of our forest. The oil palm companies, they cut some forest. They also protect some forest. But now, all of the forest belongs to the companies, and we Marin have no place to live or die in peace. The paper I'm giving today examines the possibility of social and environmental justice for Indigenous Marin communities in Merauke, West Papua, whose environments are being radically reconfigured by agro-industrial expansion in ways that disconnect them from their relationships to each other and to forest organisms whom they view as companion species in both life and in death. I'll begin by describing the adverse effects of monocrop development on Marin's bodily and affective relations with kindred plants and animals. I'll then analyse Marin's ambivalence surrounding emergent conservation practices in the palm oil sector, which are predicated on a rigid divide between nature and culture. The third section of the paper will situate these ecological transformations in the context of much longer-standing processes of the subjection of West Papuans to discriminatory regimes of colour and capital. Finally, I'll examine how Marin themselves conceive and contest the form and possibility of justice for themselves, for forest organisms, and indeed for oil palm itself. Marin often describe the forest as being alive with the movements of humans, or anim in Marin, and plant and animal grandparents, or amai, who together share common descent from ancestral creator spirits. The interactions of Marin to their amai are anchored in principles of exchange and care. Plants and animals grow to support humans by providing them with food and other resources. In return, humans must exercise respect and perform rituals as they encounter their amai in the forest, recall their stories, hunt, gather, and consume them. These reciprocal acts of care enable humans and amai to share skin and wetness, a Marin expression that refers to the exchange of life-sustaining fluids achieved through shared physical activities in the forest. For instance, those who eat sago pith take in the moisture of the sago palm, the wetness of the rivers, soils, and organisms that sustain sago's growth, and the sweat of the people with whom they rasp, leach, and consume sago pith. Those who eat meat absorb the sweat, blood, and fat of the game captured, along with that of its hunters. and these exchanges of flesh and fluid enable humans and their other-than-human kin to participate as interagentive members of a shared community of life within the forest. Becoming anim, or human then, is becoming with other than humans. Otherwise put, becoming anim is animism. Unlike forest plants and animals whose movements and interactions with humans render the landscape alive, oil palm grows alone in heavily guarded concessions. Its proliferation destroys the ecologies necessary for forest life forms to subsist. Indeed, few organisms can survive in monocrops that are characterized by low canopies, sparse undergrowth, unstable microclimates, and a toxic melange of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Robbed of their water nutrients and symbiotes, plants and animals that once thrived now wilt and starved. As rivers are diverted for irrigation and forests razed to make way for monocrops, the skin or surface of the landscape becomes flaky, dry, and wizened, and the wetness of watercourses contaminated with chemicals. Rising like a noxious sweat from tropical soils, these particle clouds infiltrate the bodies of those exposed to them. Toxins absorbed are then transmitted to those who touch or consume them across kin and kind, through the breast milk of mothers, the sweat of hunters, the blood and grease of game, and the budding shoots of sago palms. Many Marin that I worked with attribute the destructive effects of agro-industrial expansion to the voracious and destructive nature of oil palm itself, a plant that, like Marin's forest kin, is said to be endowed with agency and volition. But whereas forest organisms sustain each other's existence through exchanges of skin and wetness, oil palm refuses to coexist with other life forms because, in the words of Marina, it does not like to live with others and prefers to be alone. Similarly, Celie, a middle-aged widow, described oil palm as a selfish plant that has few friends and that does not want to share space with others. The relentless proliferation of this plant is also associated by some with insatiable greed. When oil palm is hungry, Celie continued, it eats everything, just like the bulldozers in the state. It eats the land and it eats the water. It leaves only scraps for others. Morally valued relations of intéressement across species lines are thus subverted by a self-interested plant that appropriates the resources necessary for Marind and their forest kin to survive and thrive. The violent effects of oil palm development I've just described are compounded by a profound ambivalence among Marind over the potential of conservation projects to protect what little remains of their fragmented multi-species ecologies. Over the last decade, several oil palm corporations in Merauke have begun to implement such conservation schemes as part of their commitments to sustainable palm oil production under commodity certification standards like the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, or RSPO. But despite their purportedly beneficial value in protecting biodiversity, conservation zones are a source of consternation, frustration, and sorrow for Marind. For starters, what distinguishes a high from a low conservation zone, value zone is unclear. Plants and animals, Marind emphasized, depend upon diverse ecologies that are all different, yet equally important to their subsistence, reproduction, and growth, from swamps and marshlands to mangroves and savanna. Secondly, the absence of ecological corridors connecting conservation patches limits the capacity of organisms to travel the landscape in search of food, water, and mates. And when only certain ecosystems are deemed worthy of conservation, those that fall outside this category become sacrifice zones that are assumed to be available for exploitation. While plants and animals are restricted to bounded zones of livability, Marind find themselves excluded from areas where they once hunted, foraged, and fished. Indeed, conservation areas are often caged off by barbed wire and remain strictly out of bounds to non-company personnel. Species severed from their relations to humans in the name of environmental preservation become a source of great sorrow for Marind. Most notable among these is the sago palm, a starch-producing plant whose vegetative reproduction through suckers, or sago children as Marind called them, Marind sustained through a range of direct and indirect actions. As selective felling and sucker transplanting cannot take place in conservation zones, palms reproduce sexually through seeds. Unlike vegetative reproduction that enables parent palms and their suckers or children to share the same roots and grow in close proximity to one another, the seeds of palms that reproduce sexually disperse. They germinate far away from kindred palms. They do not grow amongst their family, and so they become dry, sad, and lonely. As such, relations of care among and between organisms are thwarted by a stratification cum dissection of space and species that runs counter to Marin's characterization of the forest as a realm enlivened by the symbiotic interactions of human and other than human life forms. The exclusion of Marin from conservation zones in turn negates the possibility of creating shared memories, stories and relations between people and palms. As Pius, a Marin elder, explained, when sago and humans grow apart, they can no longer share skin and wetness. They can no longer make stories together. In Merauke, then, eco-imperialism comes in two shades of green. The green Eden of conservation on the one hand, and the green desert of monocrop plantations on the other. Both are experienced by Marin as top-down impositions, dictated by foreign others, and premised on a stark divide between nature and humans. Both operate through a process of accumulation through double dispossession that deprives communities of their lands and livelihoods. It comes as little surprise, then, that many Marin consider agribusiness and conservation to be two sides of the same coin. As Josephus, a Marin elder, put it, conservation, capitalism, it's the same thing. Injustices committed today against Marin in the name of profit and preservation in turn perpetuate much longer-standing processes of political colonization, ecological degradation, and ethnic domination in West Papua. The controversial Act of Free Choice of 1969 resulted in the forceful incorporation of West Papua into the Republic of Indonesia. Possibilities for justice and democratic reform arose with the fall of dictator Suharto and the passing of the Papuan Special Autonomy Law, but was radically weakened during the reign of Megawati Sukarnoputri, when power was firmly redirected into the hands of the central government. Today, community impoverishment remains rife in areas where top-down extractive industries are underway. The violence of the state perdures in the form of forced incarceration, physical and psychological harassment, torture, sexual violence against women, and brutal military responses to collective social movements. Against this backdrop, agribusiness expansion constitutes the latest manifestation of a collective history of suffering and oppression experienced by West Papuans under Indonesian rule, or what is locally called memoria passionis. Much like West Papuans were denied the right to determine their political futures, agribusiness projects are largely implemented without the free, prior, and informed consent of local landowners. Consultations, where undertaken, present projects as a fait accompli and a matter of national interest. Many Marin have experienced pressure from companies and military forces hired by companies to accept oil palm projects. And Marin are also routinely denied opportunities for employment within the palm oil sector because they are said to be, and I quote, lazy, uneducated, and dirty. These opportunities tend to be given instead to non-Papuan settlers who are said to be more civilized, hardworking, and hygienic. Such forms of economic and racial discrimination exacerbate pre-existing tensions that exist between Marin and non-Papuan settlers, who many Marin claim look down upon them because of their skin color and forest-based subsistence. Resonating with West Papuan independence activist Philip Karma's description of Papuans being treated like half animals, Perpetua, a young Marin mother, spoke of her children being mocked at school because of their dark skin and curly hair and being derided for hunting and foraging in the forest like wild animals. Barnabas, a village elder, reported how Javanese jeep drivers persistently refused him on board because his skin smelled bad and he might make fellow passengers sick if he touched them or coughed. With indigenous Papuans now representing less than 40% of Merauke's population, many Marin describe the growing presence of migrants also as a strategy to drive West Papuans themselves to extinction. Just as far as plants and animals are obliterated to make way for an introduced cash crop, so too, many among my informants believed that they face extinction as a result of intentional and institutionalized state violence, such as systemic acculturation, population dilution, extrajudicial killings, and the forced sterilization of indigenous women. As Elizabeth, a young woman, reported, "No one needs the people of Papua. All Indonesia needs is our land. Papuan people, we are disposable." Amidst entrenched and emergent regimes of colonialism, capitalism, and conservationism, what possibilities of justice exist for Marin and their other-than-human kin? For some Marin, justice takes the form of tangible goods and services that they are owed yet denied, monetary compensation, education, and health facilities. For others, justice is about due process. Companies should seek the free, prior, and informed consent of landowners before designing and implementing their projects. Other Marin call for justice in restorative and retributive terms. Lands lost under duress or deception should be returned to their owners, along with the crops and structures established upon them. Fines should be imposed on corporations that fail to implement social welfare projects, undermine local food and water security, and illegally burn forest to plant oil palm. For other Marind, the possibility of justice itself cannot exist until West Papua has regained its autonomy as an independent nation. Different forms of justice, in turn, come with different conundrums. For some, material goods and restorative measures cannot adequately compensate for environments already degraded, vegetation decimated, bodies contaminated, and species driven to the brink of extinction. For others, opposing or rejecting oil palm makes little sense when no alternative opportunities for economic advancement exist. Even the return of lands to local hands comes with the risk of conflict among clans because the plants, natural markers, and structures that once demarcated the boundaries of their respective territories have now disappeared. Tensions arise between Marind who are attracted by the opportunities offered by the palm oil sector and those who are opposed to it. But these factions are neither stable nor bounded. As people struggle to navigate their presence into more livable futures, they often shift from one standpoint to another and back. As Elder Pius, depicted here, put it, no one knows for certain what justice might be. No one has the key. Everyone is looking for the right path. And what of oil palm in all of this? As I described earlier, many Marind attribute the destructive effects of agribusiness to the voracious nature of oil palm itself. Yet the idea of punishing oil palm was absent in their discourses and reflections about justice. In part, this is because Marind are profoundly aware that there are human actors dictating the particular ways in which oil palm grows in Merauke and its consequent ecological effects. More than this, many Marind pitied oil palm. They contrasted the plant's totalizing subjection to human control with the freedom of forest plants and animals. For instance, some of my informants felt sorry for oil palm seeds because their growth and death were determined by humans. Women expressed sorrow over the fate of oil palm fruit that are ripped from their parents during harvesting and flung into trucks like dead bodies. Some Marind even wondered if oil palm was lowly in Merauke, where it was only recently introduced. As such, Marind are not indifferent to the life world of oil palm beyond what they themselves experience in its presence. As village elder Barnabas affirmed, oil palm too has a home and kin, somewhere far away in its native soils. Maybe oil palm too is a victim. Maybe oil palm too deserves justice. At the same time as Marind reflect on the possibility of justice for oil palm, they also invoke other, more than human actors in their discourses about justice. Oil palm plantations destroy biodiversity, and yet recent advances in ecological science point to diverse communities of flora and fauna that are finding ways to live either in parasitic or mutualistic relations with oil palm. In contrast to the charismatic megafauna often mobilized by environmental activists in anti-palm oil campaigns, these critters are labeled as background, generalist, or tramp species in conservation science. They include microbes, ants, lichens, wasps, and caterpillars, some native, others introduced. Species that flail or flourish in oil palm's company have become potent, if ambivalent, trigger points for reflection among Marind over what their own stance towards oil palm and the state should be, and the more than human implications of endorsing or eschewing agribusiness and its architectures of colonial and capitalist power. For instance, many villagers identify with the fate of native species that, like Marind, have been displaced or dispossessed to make way for introduced oil palm monocrops and their primarily non-Papuan labor force and operators. On the other hand, parasites, or enemies in Marind terms of oil palm, that undermine the plant's growth and in doing so subvert the productivist ethos of capitalism, become figures of hope for some villagers who conceive resistance to capitalist projects as the only legitimate path forward. Meanwhile, species that succeed in establishing mutualistic relations with oil palm, or friends of oil palm in Marind terms, seem to suggest that collaboration and cooperation might in fact be better strategies of survival under hegemonic political and capitalist regimes. Species alternately threatened by, threatening to, or thriving with oil palm thus act as conflicting exemplars of the potential fates and futures of indigenous Marind themselves as they seek to reconcile aspirations for survival and self-determination under entrenched and emergent regimes of color and capital. In November 2016, my host sister Mina and I traveled to Merauke City to catch a flight to Jayapura. Mina was going to visit her family and I was heading back to Australia. We sat at a small cafe near the entrance of the airport, waiting for the boarding gate to open. Mina was texting her siblings. I was reading an online article in the Sydney Morning Herald. Published a few months following the 2016 US elections and written by a fervent Republican, the piece celebrated Donald Trump as the best solution to tackling, and I quote, free spenders, organizers, intellectuals, and tree huggers. Mina glanced over my shoulder and picked up on the word tree, which she had learned a few weeks earlier during my English classes at the primary school in one of the villages. What is a tree hugger? She asked me. I explained that the expression referred to environmental campaigners and that it derived from activists quite literally hugging trees to protest against their felling. Mina went silent. Then she asked me, but what if the trees don't hug back? Mina's pithy comment provides important insights on multi-species dynamics in Merauke. First, not all life forms can or want to participate in reciprocal relations across species lines. As such, the incapacity or unwillingness of life forms to establish relations with each other is not solely or necessarily a human prerogative. The efforts of Marin to come to grips with oil palm are undermined by the fact that the plant itself, as Mina put it, refuses to hug back. The colliding ecologies of forest and plantation and everything they embody and symbolize in turn raises troubling questions for Marin over what justice might look like, how it can be achieved, and who deserves it, human or other. Grappling with justice, I suggest, requires thinking both with and within the category of the species. Thinking with species reveals the category of the human, or anim in Marin terms, to be itself a composite of relations established with other than human life forms. At the same time, thinking with species reveals how one particular vegetal life form, oil palm, does violence to the lives and futures of Marin and their other than human kin. Thinking within species situates the ecological impacts of agribusiness within the historical dehumanization of West Papuans in political and racial terms. At the same time, thinking within species invites us to reflect on the double ontology of oil palm as both a driver of destruction and a victim of human exploitation. Violence in this light reveals this as less than a human-only prerogative, but rather a multi-species act, both in terms of its subjects and objects, and indeed often both at the same time. And taking violence as a multi-species act, I would argue, also possibly enables us to reframe the assumption that only humans are capable of violence against other than humans, which perhaps in some ways is yet another form of human exceptionalism. The violent ontology attributed by Marin to oil palm, of course, troubles the relationship between ethics and epistemics. As an anthropologist myself, to take seriously the possibility of plants as immoral is also a way of taking seriously the reality of Marin, a people who are themselves rarely taken seriously in their interactions with state and corporate audiences. Yet one might ask whether it is ethical for me to speak of plants as immoral in a world where most of us suffer from what Wondersee and Schussler call plant blindness, or an indifference to vegetal life that treats it as a sessile backdrop to the putatively more interesting activities of the animal kingdom. These questions of more than human ontology and its representation are ones that I constantly ask myself, and they're also ones that Marin reflect upon, albeit for different reasons. Some Marin refrain from talking about plants as persons in their negotiations with the state and corporations, and even with supportive NGOs, because of the justified concern that it may reinforce stereotypes of indigenous peoples as primitive and superstitious. Other Marin, however, insist on framing destruction as a vegetal act, because doing so prevents them from suffering from the negative repercussions that attributing destruction to humans might trigger. As Pius, a young Marin, put it, if we blame the government for all these problems, we get harassed and put into jail. We get blamed for wanting our independence. Talking about oil palm as a problem is safer. It's funny, isn't it? Oil palm destroys the forest and our kin, but oil palm also protects us. The deflective value of framing oil palm as the destructive agent does not necessarily mean that its ontology is any less real for being instrumental. In context of necessarily strategic self-representation, ontologies can be repurposed to certain ends, ontologies as teleontologies, if you wish. Finally, the lively and lethal relations at play within capitalist natures that Marin reflect upon also challenge the prevailing characterization of monocrops as anthropogenic formations engineered and controlled solely by and for humans. Instead, capitalist natures themselves reveal themselves to be differently complex contact zones of interspecies friction, accommodation, and negotiation. My aim here is not to celebrate capitalist natures or suggest that the thriving of some organisms justifies or counterbalances the loss of others. Rather, I invite attention to liveliness within the rubble of agro-industrialism, where the budding relationalities achieved between some life forms sits awkwardly alongside the incompatibility of others and the fundamental incommensurability of life itself across and within species lines. In the plantation, too, to borrow Puig de la Bella Casa's words, nothing comes without its world. Working through the poetics and politics of more than human entanglements requires, as we have done over the past week, problematizing the concept, scope, and practice of justice. But just as importantly, it demands that we attend to the category, memberships, hierarchies, and multiplicity of the species itself within multi-species justice, both for the human species and others. And in this, we have much to learn from the critiques and conundrums of people like Marind, who are most deeply and directly mired in the fraught predicament of interspecies care. Thinking within species is no simple task. It may open new possibilities of justice for some, while foreclosing them for others. It involves traveling a path, to return to Pius's words, towards shared and livable futures, a path always already traveled alongside companions, both loving and unloving, familiar and unexpected. And indeed, for all the suffering and loss provoked by agribusiness, Marind themselves identify uncanny similarities between introduced and destructive oil palm and native and cherished sago palm. For instance, some describe the two plants as cousins or siblings in light of their morphological resemblances as members of the palm family. Oil palm's scientific name, Elaeus guineensis, or the olive of Guinea, suggests to some distant kinship with plants and peoples of African Guinea, who are bound to them through the colonial encounter and its taxonomic legacies. And just as Marind take in the nourishing wetness of sago in consuming its pith, so too, oil palm is imbued with a lucrative wetness, palm oil, that feeds and fuels distant and unknown communities of consumers. Both near kin and alien colonist, to borrow Haraway's term, oil palm becomes a compelling and troubling object of wonder because it embodies at once too much and yet too little alterity. Thank you.